The polished wood of the plaintiff's table felt slick and cold under his sweating palms. Mark tightened his grip, his knuckles turning a stark white against his tanned skin. The courtroom smelled of old paper, industrial-strength floor cleaner, and the cloying rosewater perfume radiating from the woman seated across the aisle. Her name was Karen Miller, president of the Cedar Creek Bluffs Homeowners Association, and the smile on her face was a masterpiece of condescending pity. Her lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than Mark's car, had just finished a patronizing speech about community standards and aesthetic harmony. Then, the lawyer gestured toward the defense table. Specifically, toward Mark's 16-year-old son, Leo. "Your Honor, as you can see," the lawyer said, his voice oozing a false sympathy that set Mark's teeth on edge. "We are dealing with a delicate situation. The defendant's son is clearly challenged. The HOA has shown immense patience. But this blatant disregard for the community's bylaws cannot be excused by one family's unfortunate circumstances." Karen Miller's lips curled into a tighter, more triumphant smirk. She leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer, a stage whisper designed to carry across the quiet room. "It's a shame, really. He just sits there, rocking, doesn't even seem to know where he is." Mark felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage, hot as a flash fire. He looked at Leo. His son was staring intently at the thick, leather-bound volume of North Carolina general statutes on their table. His body engaged in the gentle, rhythmic rock that had soothed him since he was a toddler. His fingers traced the embossed gold lettering on the cover, his focus absolute, his breathing slow and even. He looked calm. He looked peaceful. They saw weakness. They saw a prop. They had no idea they weren't just mocking their victim. They were mocking their own executioner. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches. This HOA takedown will blow your mind." It all started 6 months earlier, with something as simple, as necessary, as a ramp. The North Carolina summer had descended like a wet wool blanket, trapping the scents of cut grass, hot asphalt, and blooming gardenias in the humid air. The cicadas buzzed in a relentless, high-pitched chorus from the loblolly pines that ringed their modest ranch-style house. Mark had spent 2 weekends designing and building the ramp himself. It wasn't a prefab, aluminum monstrosity. He'd used pressure-treated lumber that matched their deck, sinking the posts deep into the red Carolina clay, and ensuring the grade was a gentle, manageable incline for Leo's wheelchair. It was sturdy. It was safe. It was, to Mark, a thing of beauty, a symbol of independence for his son. He'd just screwed in the final plank when Karen Miller's silver Lexus SUV crawled to a stop at his curb. The engine cut off, and the sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. Mark watched her get out. Karen was in her mid-50s, a woman who seemed to be held together by tension and hairspray. She wore a crisp, white linen pantsuit that defied the oppressive humidity, her face a mask of polite concern that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. In her hand, she held her ever-present clipboard and a small chrome measuring tape. "Afternoon, Mark," she called out, her voice as sharp and clean as the crease in her pants. "Karen," Mark replied, wiping a slick of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The air tasted thick, heavy with the promise of a late-afternoon thunderstorm. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her gaze immediately locked onto the ramp. "That's new," she stated, her tone making it sound like an accusation. She walked onto his lawn, the soft turf yielding slightly under her expensive-looking flats. The smell of her rosewater perfume was a strange, artificial note in the earthy air. "Finished it this morning. It'll make getting Leo in and out of the house a whole lot easier." "I'm sure it will," she said, her eyes scanning the structure with the critical appraisal of a building inspector. "Did you submit an architectural change request form to the board?" Mark's heart sank. He knew this was coming. In Cedar Creek Bluffs, you couldn't so much as plant a petunia without filling out a form in triplicate. "I was going to—" "Karen, this was a medical necessity. We had a bit of a scare last week getting him to a doctor's appointment." "A medical necessity," she repeated, tapping her pen against the clipboard. It made a crisp, irritating little thwack, thwack, thwack. The bylaws are quite clear, Mark. Section 7, Article C. All exterior modifications, additions, or alterations must receive prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. No exceptions. Mark felt the first flicker of defiance. His past life in military signals intelligence had trained him to analyze threats, to see the structure of power in any system. He saw Karen Miller not just as a nosy neighbor, but as the commander of a small despotic regime, and her clipboard was her scepter. "It's a wheelchair ramp, Karen, for my disabled son. It's not a sun deck." "Rules are rules," she said, offering a tight, bloodless smile. "They exist to protect our property values. An unapproved structure, well, it sets a precedent." She extended her measuring tape with a metallic schlick and measured the width of one of the planks. "And this lumber, is it on the pre-approved materials list? If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me." That night, the first official violation notice arrived. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, slid neatly into his mailbox. The language was cold, impersonal, and threatening. He had 30 days to remove the unauthorized structure or face a daily fine of $50. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the letter slick in his hand, the smell of the day's rain on the pavement drifting through the open window. He could hear Leo in his room, the soft clicks of his keyboard as he navigated one of his complex world-building games. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. This was about their right to live. Mark didn't sleep. He spent the night online, his laptop glowing in the dark. He wasn't a lawyer, but his years in SIGINT had made him an expert researcher. He knew how to dig, how to sift through mountains of data to find the one critical piece of intelligence that could turn the tide. He downloaded the Cedar Creek Bluffs HOA covenants, the bylaws, the meeting minutes for the last 5 years, and then he expanded his search, diving into state and federal law. Around 3 a.m., surrounded by the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of his computer, he found it. The first knowledge bomb. It was a provision within the Federal Fair Housing Act. An HOA is required to make reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities. This isn't a suggestion, it's the law. This includes waiving or altering rules to allow for necessary modifications, like a wheelchair ramp. Denying the ramp wasn't just a violation of their own bylaws, it was a potential violation of federal law. A slow smile spread across his face. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. This was a battle he could fight on legal high ground. He had found a chink in Karen Miller's armor. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that always smelled faintly of chlorine from the nearby pool and burnt coffee from the perpetually dirty pot in the corner. Mark walked in, his heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. He carried a printed copy of the FHA statute. Karen Miller was presiding, seated at the head of a long folding table, looking imperious under the buzzing fluorescent lights. When the floor was opened for resident concerns, Mark stood up. He calmly laid out the situation with the ramp and Leo's medical needs. Then, he presented his findings. "According to the Fair Housing Act," he began, his voice clear and strong, "denying a request for a reasonable accommodation, such as a wheelchair ramp, is a form of housing discrimination." He saw a flicker of something in Karen's eyes. Not fear, but annoyance. She was being challenged in her domain. She let him finish, then held up a hand. "Thank you for your research, Mark. However, you still failed to follow procedure. The issue here isn't the ramp itself, but your failure to submit the proper paperwork before construction. The board cannot approve a modification retroactively. It's a liability issue." A man on the board, a retired accountant named Gerald, nodded vigorously. "Procedure is paramount." It was a brilliant, slimy sidestep. She wasn't denying the ramp. She was punishing him on a technicality. She was using their own rulebook to strangle federal law in its cradle. Mark felt the trap close around him. He had brought a legal cannon to a knife fight, only to be told he'd filled out the wrong permit for his ammunition. "This isn't just my fight, it's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line." The fines began a week later. The first letter was $100. The second, for failure to comply, was $250. They arrived like clockwork every Monday morning. By the end of the month, He was staring at fines totaling over $1,000 for a ramp that allowed his son to safely leave his own home. He saw Karen Miller watching from her window sometimes, her silhouette a dark shape behind the pristine glass. It felt like a siege. One evening, Leo rolled into the kitchen where Mark was staring at the pile of violation notices, the paper feeling heavy and toxic in his hands. Leo rarely spoke about the conflict, but he absorbed everything. He was a quiet observer, a processor, of vast amounts of information. "They're using procedural arguments to negate substantive rights, Dad," Leo said softly, not looking at him, but at the letters on the table. Mark blinked. "What did you say, buddy?" "The bylaws." "I read them," Leo said, his fingers drumming a complex pattern on the arm of his wheelchair. "Section 12, Article F, it allows for emergency modifications for health and safety to be reviewed by the board post-construction. They have to review it. They can't just deny it for being pre-built." Mark stared at his son. He had completely missed that clause, buried deep in the document's dense legalese. Leo hadn't. He had seen the pattern, the connection that Mark, in his fury, had overlooked. "Leo, how did you—" "It's a closed system," Leo said simply, finally looking up. His eyes, usually distant, were sharp and clear. "Like code, full of loops and exceptions. Their argument is flawed." It was in that moment Mark realized the true nature of the battle ahead. He had been looking at it as a fight to be won with confrontation. Leo saw it as a system to be solved. And the HOA, in its arrogance, had no idea that the silent boy in the wheelchair was already mapping out their entire network, looking for the single vulnerability that would bring the whole corrupt structure crashing down. "What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments." Mark used Leo's discovery to file a formal appeal. He cited the exact bylaw, quoting it verbatim in his letter. He felt a surge of hope. This was it. A clear, undeniable clause in their own documents. They couldn't ignore it. The response came 3 days later. It wasn't a letter. It was a local sheriff's deputy, walking up his driveway with a thick envelope. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, making the ramp look like a dark scar on the landscape. The air was still and heavy, the cicadas strangely silent. The deputy looked uncomfortable. "Mark Jensen?" "That's me. I've been asked to serve you with this," he said, handing over the packet. Mark's hands trembled as he tore it open. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. Words jumped out at him. Failure to cure violation. Accumulated fines and legal fees. And then, the phrase that made the blood drain from his face. "The association has placed a lien on your property." A lien. It wasn't just about fines anymore. They were making a move on his house, his home. The one place in the world he and Leo were supposed to be safe. He looked up from the document, his vision blurring, and saw Karen Miller standing on her porch across the street, arms crossed, watching the scene with a look of cold, serene satisfaction. She had escalated far beyond what he ever imagined. This was no longer a disagreement. This was war. And she had just revealed that she was willing to burn his entire world to the ground to win it. The lien notice wasn't just paper. It felt like a physical weight, a block of ice pressing against Mark's chest. The smell of the laser printer's toner, sharp and chemical, seemed to cling to the air in his living room for days. Every creak of the house, every groan of the pipes sounded like a final dying breath. He and Leo were no longer homeowners. They were tenants on borrowed time, their home a hostage in a war he hadn't been prepared to fight. The ramp outside, once a symbol of defiance, now looked like the piece of evidence that would convict him. Karen Miller's next move was an exercise in psychological warfare. She didn't need to knock on his door. She had a more insidious weapon. The Cedar Creek Bluffs monthly email newsletter arrived in his inbox with a cheerful ping. The subject line read, "Community harmony and protecting our investments." Inside, nestled between a notice about pool hours and a recipe for gluten-free zucchini bread, was a thinly veiled attack. A friendly reminder, it began, that adherence to our community's aesthetic standards is what maintains our high property values. When one homeowner decides the rules don't apply to them, it creates a visual blight that can impact us all. Furthermore, unapproved structures can create insurance liabilities and invite costly litigation. forcing the HOA to spend our collective dues on legal fees instead of community improvements. It was masterful. She never used his name, but every resident on their street knew exactly who she was talking about. The digital ink was barely dry before the whispers started. Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, who used to wave from her garden, now found her petunias intensely fascinating whenever Mark drove by. The father who coached Leo's former Challenger League baseball team gave him a curt, uncomfortable nod at the grocery store. The air in the neighborhood grew thick with suspicion. He could feel their gazes from behind their pristine, double-paned windows. It was the scent of social isolation, more bitter than any legal notice. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. Mark knew he was being flanked. A direct assault had failed. Now he was being cut off from support. His military training kicked in. You don't win a siege by sitting inside your fortress waiting to starve. You conduct reconnaissance. You identify friendly forces. You find the enemy's weakness, and you exploit it. His first stop was Arthur Pendleton's house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Arthur was a retired history teacher in his late 70s, a man who had lived in his house since before Cedar Creek. Bluffs was a formal development, back when it was just a collection of homes on a wooded hill. His porch smelled of pipe tobacco and old yellowing paperbacks. The rhythmic squeak of his rocking chair was a permanent part of the neighborhood's soundscape. "A lean, you say?" Arthur mused, tamping tobacco into his pipe with a gnarled thumb. He looked out over the manicured lawns, his gaze distant. "She's a piece of work, that one. Came in here about 10 years ago with her developer husband, and decided the place needed rescuing. Formed the HOA, pushed it through with a lot of slick talk about property values and exclusivity." He lit his pipe, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the deep lines on his face. "But some of us remember what it was like before. Just neighbors. You needed something, you asked. You built something, folks came over to admire it, not measure it." Mark leaned against the porch railing, the painted wood warm from the afternoon sun. "I need to fight this, Arthur. But I'm one guy against a whole system. A system. Has cracks, son," Arthur said, puffing a cloud of sweet-smelling smoke into the humid air. "You just have to know where to look. Karen's power comes from the belief that she is the rules. You want to beat her, you have to prove she's just as subject to them as anyone else. Or better yet," he said, a sly twinkle in his eye, "that she's breaking more of them than you are." It was a start, a piece of human intelligence. His next move was riskier. He needed an inside source. He thought of Sarah, a young single mother who had been elected to the HOA board 6 months ago. He'd seen the way she flinched in the meetings, whenever Karen raised her voice. He found her at the community playground, pushing her daughter on the swings. The air smelled of wood chips and sunscreen. "Sarah," he began, keeping his voice low, "I know this is awkward, but I need your help." She glanced around nervously, her face pale. "Mark, I can't. Karen, she'd kill me. My lease is up for renewal, and her husband's company owns my condo unit." Mark's blood ran cold. It wasn't just influence, it was direct financial leverage. A power lever he hadn't seen. "She's holding your housing over your head to keep you in line on the HOA board? Sarah, that's not just unethical. It's likely illegal." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know. But what can I do? I can't afford to move." She pushed the swing, the chains groaning in a mournful rhythm. "Look, I can't talk to you in public, but sometimes the board uses a shared Dropbox for draft documents before meetings. Sometimes they forget to delete the old drafts." She wouldn't look at him, but it was enough. It was a digital breadcrumb, a crack in their secure communications. That night, the siege on Mark's house intensified. A new violation notice appeared, this time for a small patch of crabgrass near the mailbox. The next day, another for his garbage can being visible from the street for 15 minutes past the 7 p.m. deadline. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, designed to bleed him dry emotionally and financially. He'd lie awake at night, listening, imagining he could hear the scrape of Karen Miller's measuring tape against his siding. But while Karen was focused on his lawn, Mark and Leo were building their war room in the den. Mark, using the intel from Sarah and his own research skills, was digging into the HOA's operational history. He filed public information requests with the county for permits, contracts, and vendor payments. Leo, meanwhile, was doing what he did best, finding the patterns. He sat for hours, cross-referencing the HOA bylaws with a spreadsheet of every home on their street, which he had meticulously mapped out using public satellite imagery. "Dad," Leo said one evening, pointing a finger at his monitor. The screen was a patchwork of colored squares. "Selective enforcement." Mark leaned in. Leo had highlighted Karen's house in red. "Her fountain," Leo stated. "It's Italian marble. The bylaws, Section 9, Article B, explicitly state all water. Features must be constructed of natural domestic stone. Italian marble is not domestic." He then pointed to Gerald's house, the accountant from the board. "His tool shed. It's over the maximum allowable square footage by 20%, and its roof pitch doesn't match the main dwelling, a violation of Section 8, Article D," he went on, pointing out a dozen other violations, all belonging to board members or their close friends. An unapproved fence here, a banned political sign there, a basketball hoop that wasn't on the pre-approved color list. It was a stunning tapestry of hypocrisy. This was the knowledge bomb Arthur had told him to find. The legal doctrine of selective enforcement meant that if an HOA consistently ignored violations by some members while prosecuting others, its authority to enforce that rule could be nullified entirely. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. Mark hired a lawyer, a young, hungry guy named David who worked on a flat fee. David's office smelled of new carpet and ambition. When Mark laid out the file Leo had compiled, complete with dated photographs, satellite imagery, and highlighted sections of the bylaws, David's eyes went wide. "My God," David breathed, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This isn't just a file. This is a nuke." They sent a cease and desist letter. It was 10 pages long, detailing every instance of selective enforcement, citing the legal precedents, and demanding the immediate removal of the lien and the forgiveness of all fines. For 2 agonizing weeks, there was silence. The violation notices stopped. Mark felt a fragile, unfamiliar sensation. Hope. Then, a letter arrived from the HOA's expensive law firm. The tone was no longer aggressive. It was conciliatory. They agreed to remove the lien and waive the fines, citing a desire to resolve the matter amicably. It was a victory. Mark felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He had won. He walked out onto his front porch, the setting sun casting a warm, golden light on Leo's ramp. He had stared down the bully and made her blink. He thought it was over. He was wrong. What he had mistaken for surrender was merely a strategic retreat. The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. A week later, Mark learned the truth behind Karen's sudden capitulation. He learned about her real vulnerability. Arthur called him, his voice grim. "Turn on the local news, son. Channel 4. Mark flipped on the TV. There was a segment about a major new proposed development project, Cedar Creek Bluffs, Phase 2. The developer being interviewed, talking about luxury homes and community values, was Karen Miller's husband. The project needed town council approval, and the public hearing was in 2 weeks. Arthur's voice came over the phone. "See it now?" Her husband needs Cedar Creek to look like a perfect, harmonious paradise to get his new project approved. The last thing he needs is a resident suing the HOA for discrimination and winning. Your fight was a direct threat to their bottom line, a multi-million-dollar threat. Mark finally understood. The pride, the control. It was all tied to money and power far bigger than a few neighborhood rules. Her weakness wasn't just her hypocrisy. It was her ambition. And now that she'd neutralized his lawsuit, she was free to retaliate in a way he never saw coming. The official-looking manila envelope was taped to his front door. It wasn't from the HOA. The return address was the town of Cedar Creek Municipal Building. His hands were numb as he tore it open. The paper was thick, official, and cold to the touch. The letterhead bore the town's official seal. He read the words, but his brain refused to process them. Notice of condemnation. Pursuant to a review of municipal records. Outstanding permit violation dating back to 2005. Unapproved rear deck extension. Structure deemed fundamentally unsafe for occupancy. The deck The one he and Leo spent every summer evening on. The one built by the previous owner over a decade before Mark even bought the house. Karen, using her husband's clout with the town planning department, had dug into the municipal archives and found an ancient procedural error, a final inspection that was never signed off. She had weaponized the town itself against him. At the bottom of the page, in bold red ink, was the final verdict. The homeowner is hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 30 days. 30 days. He had 30 days to leave his home. Tucked behind the condemnation notice was a small, clipped newspaper article. The ink smeared slightly under his trembling thumb. It was from the local paper, a quote from an anonymous concerned neighbor. It talked about the dangers of unpermitted structures and the need for the town to protect residents from unsafe homes like Mark Jensen's. The camera flashes came a moment later. A news van from Channel 4 had pulled up to his curb, tipped off, and ready. A reporter was standing on his lawn, pointing a camera at the red condemnation notice on his door. Karen had not only succeeded in getting him evicted, she was broadcasting his humiliation to the entire town, painting him as a negligent danger to the community she was poised to profit from. The war wasn't over. It had just entered its deadliest phase. The condemnation notice felt like a death certificate for his life. The bold red ink seemed to bleed through the paper, staining his hands. 30 days. 432 hours until he and his son were officially homeless. The smell of defeat was the scent of cardboard boxes and packing tape, a smell that began to permeate their house as Mark started the soul-crushing task of dismantling their world. He packed Leo's books, the worn spines a silent testament to his son's brilliant mind. He wrapped the coffee mugs from their kitchen, each one holding a memory of a quiet morning. The house grew hollow, its silence echoing with the ghosts of laughter and conversation. Every sound was magnified. The scrape of a box on the hardwood floor, the sigh of the wind outside, each one a countdown to their eviction. His lawyer, David, was sympathetic but pragmatic. Mark, fighting a municipal condemnation order is a nightmare. It's an expensive uphill battle against city attorneys with unlimited resources. By the time we could even get a hearing, the 30 days would be long gone. It was a tactical checkmate. Karen hadn't just beaten him. She had switched to an entirely different chessboard, one where he didn't know the rules and couldn't afford to play. Desperation drove him back to Arthur Pendleton's porch. The old history teacher listened patiently, his face a grim mask in the twilight. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and impending rain. "She used the town," Mark said, his voice raw. "She bypassed the HOA and used the full weight of the government to crush me." Arthur slowly relit his pipe, the flame dancing for a moment in the gathering dark. "Then you stop fighting the order, son. You have to invalidate the person who filed it. Not Karen, her power, the HOA. You have to prove her entire authority is built on sand." "How? I've read every bylaw, every covenant she ever wrote." "Not her covenants," Arthur said, his voice dropping, leaning forward with a sudden intensity. "The original ones, the master deed. Before this was Cedar Creek Bluffs, LLC, it was just Cedar Creek, a different set of rules. I've still got my original deed from '78 somewhere in the attic. The rules were simpler then. Meant to keep things neighborly, not to build a kingdom. It was a flare in the darkness, a piece of signal in a sea of noise." Mark's SIGINT instincts, long dormant, surged to life. He wasn't just fighting the current enemy. He had to uncover the enemy's origin story. The next morning, he wasn't packing boxes. He and Leo were in Mark's car, driving to the county records office. The records office was a tomb of forgotten facts, a place that smelled of dust, decaying paper, and the faint, acidic tang of microfilm developer. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, shadowless light on the rows of gray metal shelves. Mark requested the original plat maps and master covenants for the Cedar Creek development, circa 1975. The clerk returned with a massive, heavy ledger, its leather cover cracked and faded. For hours they worked. Mark scanned document after document, the dense, archaic legal language blurring together. It was Leo who found it. He wasn't reading the documents linearly. He was scanning them, his eyes darting across the pages, absorbing, their structure, their logic. His finger suddenly stopped on a paragraph deep within the Master Covenant, a section detailing how the covenants themselves could be amended. "Dad," he whispered, his voice resonating with quiet discovery in the hushed room. He pointed. "Here." Mark leaned over, the scent of old paper filling his nostrils. The clause was ironclad. For the properties contained within Phase 1 of the development, the oldest section, where their house and Arthur's were located, any amendments to the Master Covenant, including the formation of a binding, mandatory homeowners association, required the unanimous written consent of 100% of the homeowners, not a simple majority, not 75%. Unanimous. Mark's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He felt the blood rush to his face. "Leo, get the documents for the HOA's formation, the one from 10 years ago." They pulled the microfiche, the machine, whirring and clicking as it scrolled through the images. And there it was, the 2010 filing that officially created the Cedar Creek Bluffs HOA. It was signed and ratified by 78% of the residents, not 100. This was the final knowledge bomb, the one that changed everything. The Cedar Creek Bluffs Homeowners Association had no legal authority over his home. It had never been legally formed in his part of the neighborhood. For a decade, Karen Miller had been running a ghost government. Every fine, every violation, every threatening letter, and, most importantly, the lien that started this entire nightmare was an act of fraud. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. The final battle would not be fought in a courtroom over his condemnation. It would be fought in the court of public opinion, at the very event Karen had tried so hard to protect. The town council meeting for her husband's Phase 2 development project. The council chambers were packed. The air was a mixture of stale coffee, perfume, and political tension. Local news cameras were set up in the back, their red lights glowing like predatory eyes. Karen and her husband sat in the front row, looking confident and serene. She caught Mark's eye as he walked in and gave him a small, pitying smile. The smile of a victor graciously acknowledging the vanquished. She had no idea she was staring at the man who was about to burn her empire to the ground. Mr. Miller's presentation was slick, full of architectural renderings and talk of sustainable luxury. He pointed to Cedar Creek Bluffs as his flagship success, a model of community harmony and appreciating property values. The council members nodded, impressed. Then the public comment period began. Mark was the first to the podium. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He could feel Karen's smug gaze boring into his back. He adjusted the microphone, the metallic tang of it close to his lips. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, amplified through the room's speakers. "My name is Mark Jensen, a resident of Cedar Creek. I'm not here tonight to talk about the future of Phase 2. I'm here to talk about the past of Phase 1. He saw Karen shift in her seat, a flicker of confusion on her face. This wasn't part of her script. Mark held up a certified copy of the 1975 Master Deed. "This is the founding document of our neighborhood. It contains a clause, Article 17, which stipulates that the formation of a mandatory HOA requires the unanimous 100% consent of the homeowners." He then held up the 2010 HOA formation document. And this is the document, filed by Mr. Miller's company, that created the HOA with only 78% of the vote, which means, for the last 10 years, the Cedar Creek Bluffs HOA has been operating in my neighborhood without a shred of legal authority. Every fine they've levied, every lien they've filed, has been an act of fraud. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. The town attorney, a man with a perpetually worried expression, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "This is outrageous!" Karen's voice cut through the room. She was on her feet, her face a blotchy, furious red. Her mask of serene control had utterly shattered. "He's a disgruntled resident making baseless accusations to derail our project." "Is it baseless, Mrs. Miller?" Mark asked, his voice never rising. He looked directly at the town attorney. "The documents are here, certified copies from the county clerk. The truth has been sitting in the public record for 40 years. You were just so sure of your own power that you never thought to check." The cameras swiveled from Mark to Karen, their lenses zooming in on her unraveling composure. Her husband was trying to pull her back into her seat, whispering furiously, but she shook him off. "He built an illegal structure. He's a danger to the neighborhood." And then came the moment of absolute poetic justice, the full circle callback. A reporter from the local paper called out, "Mr. Jensen, this is an incredible discovery. How did you possibly uncover something that's gone unnoticed for so long?" Mark paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. He turned his head and looked toward the back of the room where Leo sat in his wheelchair, watching the proceedings with his usual quiet intensity. "I didn't," Mark said, his voice now thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "My son did." Every head in the room turned to look at Leo. "You see," Mark continued, his voice ringing with power and love, "at a court hearing a few weeks ago, the HOA's lawyer mocked my son. He called him challenged. Their president, Mrs. Miller, whispered that he didn't even seem to know where he was." Mark's gaze locked with Karen's, and he saw true fear in her eyes for the first time. But Leo knew exactly where he was. "He was inside your labyrinth of rules. And while you were busy measuring my lawn and trying to make us homeless, my son, the boy you dismissed, was quietly, methodically, and brilliantly finding the single loose thread that would unravel your entire fraudulent regime. He did it not with threats or intimidation, but with quiet, inescapable logic." Leo, feeling the weight of all those eyes, simply looked at Karen Miller. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture more powerful than any gavel slam. It was checkmate. The boy they had mocked as a prop was the genius who had engineered their downfall. The aftermath was a swift and total collapse for the Millers. The Phase 2 project was suspended pending an investigation. The town council launched a formal inquiry into the HOA's activities, and the district attorney's office began investigating potential fraud and extortion charges against the board. The condemnation on Mark's house was rescinded within 24 hours. For the residents of Phase 1, it was as if a decade-long fog had lifted. The HOA was legally declared void, its rules unenforceable. A week later, Mark was sitting on his deck, the evening sun casting long, peaceful shadows across the lawn. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, but for the first time in months, it was just a smell, not a threat. He heard the gentle whir of Leo's chair coming up the ramp beside him. The ramp. The beautiful, sturdy, perfectly built structure that had started it all. It was no longer a violation or a symbol of defiance. It was a monument to the fact that they were still here, in their home, safe. Arthur and Sarah came over, bringing beers and a homemade apple pie. Other neighbors, now free and emboldened, stopped by to thank him, to thank Leo. The whispers of suspicion had been replaced by the sounds of a community being reborn. Mark looked at his son, who was gazing out at the Carolina sunset, a content look on his face. They thought the fight was about a ramp, but it was never about the wood or the nails. It was about the simple, unshakable idea that a home should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. It was about proving that power built on arrogance is a fragile thing, and that justice isn't always for those who shout the loudest, but for those who are willing to read the fine print, and for the quiet geniuses who see the patterns everyone else misses. They were home, and they were free. If you believe that no one is above the law, hit that subscribe button so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to see what's possible when one family refuses to back down. Want to see another insane HOA takedown? Click the video on your screen right now. You won't believe what this next one tried to get away with.